Welcome back to Gen Z Bible class. We are entering into a very interesting chapter today. Some people might think it's boring because it has a lot of names in it, but it's chapter 10 of Genesis, and sometimes it's called the Table of Nations because it follows along the genealogies of all of the descendants of Noah. Remember, Noah had three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and we've been kind of following that whole family line. We talked about one in particular, and how last time we talked about how Noah had blessed two of his sons and cursed one of them, and so we get a little bit more information, a little more specific information about how all that worked out. So we'll start by just reading the first verse, which kind of explains what the chapter is about. Verse 1, this is the account of Shem, Ham, and Japheth, Noah's sons, who themselves had sons after the flood. So basically this just explains to us what this whole chapter is about. And I guess the main question, though, would be, why is it important? Because, in terms of these genealogies, if you just look at them and kind of skim over them, and all you see are these names, and you don't know who they are, except, they're so-and-so's descendant. And why is this even in the Bible? Well, we've covered that a little bit already, but there's a number of reasons why this particular chapter is important. First of all, well, it tells us where we all come from. That's a big thing these days. Everybody wants to know, through their genes, where they came from. And so you can subscribe, you can send your DNA in and have it analyzed, and they can tell you something about your family tree, which area of the world you came in. Well, if you go back far enough, and historians, there are people who have dedicated their lives to trying to figure out how all this fits together. And the interesting thing about this particular section of the Bible is that it gives us a lot of names and nations eventually. All these little family groups eventually grow to become nations, and they find their way, throughout the world. And they've done some interesting research in tying into this account in the Bible, so that it's not just fiction. That's a whole another thing about these genealogies. It reminds us that the Bible is a book of history. It's not just a pretend book, with fairy tales in it. So that's one of the reasons. I think the other reason is because we've already begun to see how God is going to do something special within one group of people. Now, we already saw that through the line of Seth. Remember how his line was the only one of all of Adam's descendants that made it through the flood. And that kind of reminds us that, God is in control of things, and that he has the past, the present, and the future all, under his control. So we're looking at the development of all these nations, and just so you know how this chapter is set up, it gives you it's kind of in three different groups, the descendants of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And with each one of them, it gives all the names of the descendants of each of those three of Noah's sons. So you end up with 70 different names, including Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And that's an interesting number. 7 is always that perfect number. But it reminds us again of God's sovereignty and how he has things in control. But we also know that God is going to call out a special people. There's going to be like this special line of people within all of these nations. And that's another reason why it's helpful, because it kind of puts God's chosen people, the Jews, in perspective of the rest of the world. And again, it reminds us that God has this sovereign plan that he is putting into effect. So it helps us understand how Israel, God's chosen people, fits into the whole scheme of things. And finally, it gives us a little more information on what we were talking about last time. Remember back in Genesis chapter 9, when Noah blesses two of his sons and he curses one of them. He actually curses one of the sons of Ham. And we talked about how that was Canaan was his name, and he is the father of the Canaanites, and they come into play later on in the Bible, and I think that's why he gets special attention. And we also noticed how this prophecy of Noah said that the descendants of Japheth would have the most territory. And as you look at the way that worked out, he being the father of Indo-European and Asian people, and if you looked at the world today and who owns what real estate, I think you would have to say that Japheth, his descendants, did pretty well in that category. And then that Shem becomes the father of the Semitic people, or the Jewish people. And we're just kind of reviewing a little bit here, and how the promise was that Japheth would dwell in the tents of Shem, which, how does that work? Because Shem doesn't seem to have as many descendants. In fact, in terms of sheer numbers, probably Shem's is the smallest people group, that descends from these three sons. So, when we talked about the fact that it was through Shem that God would bless the world, and through him, through his line, would send his son who would save the whole world. So in that sense, it's kind of a figurative way to describe spiritually what was going on. That Japheth, which was most of the world, I guess you could maybe call it the Gentile world, as the Bible might describe it, becomes blessed by the house of Shem, and in that sense they come to dwell in the tents of Shem. It's really interesting to see how that works out. And again, we get more information on that as we read this chapter. So the Japhethites are the first ones, the sons of Japheth are the first ones mentioned, and there are 14 descendants of Japheth, which is interesting because his line ends up being, the most in number, I guess you could say, as you go through history. But there's just one thing that is mentioned about them. And again, we're not going to read all these names, but we're going to look at each of the lines, and there are a few things that stand out in each of these lines of descendancy. Now with Japheth, it's interesting that it mentions one thing specifically about him in Genesis 10:5. From these, the maritime peoples spread out into their territories by their clans within their nations, each with its own language. So he describes them as being maritime people, boats. And I guess that would be consistent with this idea that he was able to cover a lot of ground in his descendants. Basically, we think of the descendants of Japheth as, if you want to be very general about it, heading north. The descendants of Shem would be thought of as heading east, and the descendants of Ham would be heading towards the south, Africa and that part of the world. Who gets the western part? Well, I think if you think of the geography from the point of view of Israel, if you went west, you'd be in the Mediterranean Sea, and beyond that, the Atlantic Ocean. So I guess they didn't worry too much about the west. Eventually, people get there. So that's something interesting about the Japhethites. That's the one specific thing they mentioned here that's mentioned about them. Other than that, it's just a bunch of names. The next group that's mentioned are the Hamites. And there are 28 names mentioned under Ham as his descendants. And there's one person in particular, well, actually two people that show up in the line of Ham that really play a big role in the Bible in parts to come. And one of them is mentioned in Genesis 10:8. Cush was the father of Nimrod, who became a mighty warrior on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. And that's why it is said, like Nimrod, a mighty hunter before the Lord. The first centers of his kingdoms were Babylon, Uruk, Akkad, and Calneh in Shinar. And then it mentions 4 other cities in Assyria. So what's going on here, and why this attention given to Nimrod? Well, first of all, he's a mighty hunter, so I guess he had a reputation. You think, back in those days, remember they were allowed to eat meat, so if you were a mighty hunter, that means you could go out and provide food for your people, and that would give you some authority, and it would put you in a position of leadership. So that could be one of the aspects of Nimrod that made him famous. But it also goes on to talk about how he built all these cities. So he became a very significant leader. And the other thing about him is, well, we're going to be looking at him in the next chapter, because there's a whole chapter about the things that Nimrod did. And it marked a really big change in the world as it was being developed at that point. So that's Nimrod. He was a mighty hunter, and he built cities. He was a builder of cities. Another person that's mentioned under the line of Ham is Cain. Again, the Canaanite people. Canaan is his son that we talked about last week that was actually cursed. He was the one that was cursed. And what does it say about them? In Genesis 10:18-20, later the Canaanite clans scattered, and the borders of Canaan reached from Sidon towards Gerar as far as Gaza, and then towards Sodom, Gomorrah, Admah, Zeboim, and as far as Lasha. Well, okay, I don't know where most of those places are, but there's 2 places that we are familiar with. One of them is Gaza. Now, if you haven't heard anything about Gaza, you haven't been listening to the news. But this is the same place that we're having all the issues today in the world. And I think it's interesting that really becomes kind of a continual fulfillment of this prophecy that Noah made. That this, I guess you could say, bad blood between the descendants of Canaan and the descendants of Shem. And this has been a part of world history that we've seen since that time. 2 other places that perhaps if you've read the Bible, you've heard of these places before: Sodom and Gomorrah. They are mentioned as 2 places where, and there's a whole story about that the people became so evil there that God actually destroyed them with fire. He sent down fire from heaven because the people got so bad there. So they have a very bad reputation. And this is all part of the descendants of Ham. So those 2 things are mentioned specifically under his descendants. And then we finally get to the Semites, and there were 25 names under them. Now, by the way, if you add up the 25, the 28, the 14, and then Shem, Ham, and Japheth, you come up with the number 70. If I did my math right, and I think I did. So you end up with these 70 different names in this table of nations. Under the Semites, there was only one comment that was made apart from just giving the person's name, and that was in Genesis 10:25. 10:21 is where this whole line starts. The sons were also born to Shem, whose older brother was Japheth. So this is consistent with our idea that Japheth was the oldest, Ham was the middle son, and Shem was the youngest. But in Genesis 10:25, one was named Peleg, because in his time the earth was divided. And what is that talking about? Well, we're going to learn a little bit more about that next time in chapter 11. The earth being divided. And this is a story about how God, was looking down on what was going on and decided it was time to kind of split people up. So that's where he confused their languages, gave them all these different languages so that they were kind of forced to spread out into the earth because they couldn't, they lost their common language. And again, we're talking about the world Christian worldview, that's a big part of it. That when we think about where everybody came from, as opposed to the evolutionary worldview, well, we were monkeys and then we got smarter and decided to become people, and that we invented our own language, and all these things just sort of evolved. Well, the biblical account is different, and it gives us a very clear, we started from Adam and Eve. And when it comes to languages, this wasn't something that we invented ourselves, but it was something that God gave us, and that He is behind the languages that people were divided up into. More on that next week. So I think this division that is being talked about here is most likely talking about this experience with the Tower of Babel. And we'll find out more about that next week, as we said. So the whole thing ends with this summary statement in the very last verse, Genesis 10:32. These are the clans of Noah's sons, according to their lines of descent. Within their nations, from these the nations spread out over the earth after the flood. And again, that's just like it began. These are the sons of Noah, and these are the descendants they have, and this is kind of saying the same thing to wrap everything up. So what do we conclude? I know this is one of those chapters that you could easily skip over, but we're trying to see the significance and the importance in it. And I think if there was an overall theme, or maybe an overall lesson, we're reminded of the sovereignty of God. That from the very beginning, God had a plan. And we're going to end, this is going to be our good word, with a verse from the book of Acts. And the background of this particular verse, well, Paul, the Apostle Paul, is in Athens. And of course, Athens in Greece was like the epicenter of all learning and philosophy and knowledge. And, Paul actually, he didn't do so well in Athens because these guys, they pretty much figured they had everything figured out. And as a result, you would go to Athens and you would find all these different statues and all these different gods that they had invented. And Paul was pointing that out to them, and basically he was bringing them this message that there is one God. And you can know that God, and He is the God that created the heavens and the earth. So he makes the statement to the people in Athens, which I think is probably a very clear picture of how we understand God's sovereignty. And here it is. This is Acts chapter 17, verses 26 to 28. From one man He made all the nations, that they should inhabit the whole earth, and He marked out their appointed times in history and boundaries of their lands. God did this so that they would seek Him and perhaps reach out for Him and find Him, though He is not far from any one of us. For in Him we live and move and have our being. I think that's just a wonderful description of God's sovereignty, because it reminds us of how, from the very beginning, He started with this one man, and through that one man, all of us came into being. Well, man and woman, I should say, Adam and Eve, but through them, that one first couple, everything that we see now in terms of human beings, that's where the beginning was. And also that it's not He's out there, running the overall picture of things, but He's with us as well. There is this intimate aspect to who He is, so that in Him, we, each one of us as individuals, we live and move, and we have our being. We are here, we exist because of this sovereign God who is in control of all these things. He's in control of every little thing that comes into our life and all the big things that we see going on throughout history. And He will be in charge until the day He returns. So that's probably a good way to end up this chapter, to wind up this chapter. Yeah, I know it's a lot of names, but when you put it all in perspective, I think it's a blessing, and it helps us to understand who God is and to understand our relationship with Him. So I hope this has been a blessing to you. And again, well, next time we're going to be looking at the story of the Tower of Babel, which is another, really fascinating event in history. So I hope you're able to join us then next time on Gen Z Bible Class.